We're here with Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey. How are you, sir?
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Very, very well. Well, we have two big stories here. First of all, you have a breaking story about you sued the Biden administration on this illegal, unconstitutional student loan activity. Tell us what's happened here.
Yeah, look, this is a huge win for the American people and for working Missourians. Joe Biden is trying to saddle working Missouri families with Ivy League debt in yet another unconstitutional, illegal student loan cancellation program. I submit to you that any working family out there or small business owner will tell you there's no such thing as debt cancellation. Someone has to pay the tab. And in this instance, it's a tab of almost $500 million. It's actually more expensive than the first student loan cancellation program that President Biden put forward and that we successfully defeated at the United States Supreme Court. So he already had a plan B ready last year about this time when he lost the first round, and he came back with the Higher Education Act and said that somehow that authorizes him to redistribute a $500 billion in debt owed on student loans. And, of course, there is no textual basis for that program. Congress has twice rejected bills of that kind. So we filed suit, and just today, this afternoon, the court issued a stay enjoining implementation of the Biden plan to cancel this debt. This is a huge win for the rule of law, the Constitution, and for taxpayers of the state of Missouri.
Okay, so you filed it in federal court in Missouri?
Yes, sir, in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri, and that's who has handed down its decision today.
Well, this is a big deal. The media will do everything it can to smother it with a pillow. So it's important that it gets out there before this debate, because virtually every court that's looked at this, the first one, and now you're having them look at this one, they keep telling him, you don't have the power of the purse. We have separation of power. He doesn't give a damn, does he?
He doesn't, and he's out on the stump bragging about the fact that he doesn't give a damn. I submit to you, this is a constitutional crisis. You've got a president who is charged with faithfully executing the law, bragging about willful defiance of the Supreme Court in its decisions on this matter. If you'll recall, the last time the Supreme Court ruled on this issue, they struck down Biden's first attempt to unconstitutionally redistribute wealth under the major questions doctrine. Well, that same doctrine applies here because the price tag's even greater. And we know under the major questions doctrine that Congress doesn't hide an elephant in a mouse hole. If Congress wants to redistribute that much wealth, they've got to be explicit in the text of a statute. No such statute has been enacted by Congress. Thus, the president lacks this both constitutional and statutory authority.
Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey, here's what he's figuring. By the time the law catches up with him, he will have handed out this money. The election will be over, and he will have gotten the benefit from it. That's pretty diabolical, isn't it?
Mark, I think you're absolutely right. I think this is an attempt to interfere in the election by buying votes with a key demographic that he's losing, in which he's losing ground. This is really the flip side of the coin of lawfare. On lawfare, they're attacking the president to try to keep him off the ballot and deny voters of access to President Trump. And on the other side, President Biden's got to buy votes. They can't win a straight-up fair election on the merits, so they have to rig the system and cheat in order to win. And that's what this was. It was a naked attempt to hold power, to retain power. They're so desperate, they're willing to spend your and my tax dollars to do it.
Let's talk about this other issue, because this is something I've kind of been promoting on the air, and I think it's very important. So let me lay it out, and let's see if I have this right. You are going to sue the state of New York, which gives you original jurisdiction to go to the Supreme Court at some point, actually very quickly. And you're suing them because they're interfering in the election of the president, interfering with the citizens of Missouri to have an opportunity to have a fulsome campaign, and so forth and so on. Do I have that about right?
Mark, you're dead on. I mean, at the end of the day, the lawfare being committed in the state of New York by the Federal Department of Justice and in the state of Georgia constitute election interference at its worst. And what's happening is Alvin Bragg and his cohort, Matthew Colangelo, who was deployed from Biden's crooked Department of Justice to assist at the trial court level, have not obtained a legally valid conviction because their case is replete with constitutional error. The ambition was never to obtain a legally valid conviction. The ambition was always to tether President Trump to a courtroom and eventually to onerous, burdensome sentencing post-July 15th and a gag order that both takes him off the campaign trail and silences him. That denies Missourians a sovereign state co-equal participation in a national election in the heat of a campaign in what turns out to be the most consequential presidential election in this nation's history. That's election interference. And under Article 3, Section 2 of the United States Constitution, you're right, the United States Supreme Court has exclusive original jurisdiction over this case.
Let me ask you something, Mr. Attorney General. I'm not going to give the names because that would be violating codes. I spoke to 2 attorneys general and a governor, and they all took a very, distant look at this thing, and I tried to persuade them that there are a couple of avenues here, including the act of writs, but that wouldn't involve you. That would involve Trump and his lawyers. But that you would get original jurisdiction if a state, particularly a group of states, would even be more powerful, would say, wait a minute. What New York State is doing, what a Manhattan prosecutor and an acting state judge in Manhattan are doing, we don't need to sit around for the appellate process in New York. This is affecting the citizens of Missouri, the citizens or any other state for that matter. They have seized federal authority, jurisdiction on the campaign laws. They have violated the 5th and 14th Amendments, due process and equal protection. You know, the whole laundry list of things. And you got one candidate who has an unfettered, field. You got another candidate who has to go to court to see what he can and cannot do. He's got a gag order on him. And the people of my state want an open and fair election. That's pretty much the argument, right?
That's exactly right. I think it's important to remind folks, too, the First Amendment right to free speech does not only apply to the speaker, it applies to the listeners. The gag order is perhaps the most pernicious element of the lawfare because, again, it denies voters access to hear from their chosen presidential candidate in the heat of a campaign. And you're right, it's a rogue prosecutor who moved to the court for the gag order and a rogue judge who granted it. Gag orders are intended to protect the defendant's right to a fair trial. Well, President Trump, as the defendant, wants to waive that right and talk to his constituency, he should be allowed to do that. That's why there's such a strong First Amendment presumption against gag orders. And so this was completely unconstitutional, and Missouri has a sovereign interest that we are going to assert the traditional individual appellate remedy in a criminal case at the state level is not adequate to redress the grievances of those harmed here in the state of Missouri. That's why we've got to act now and go straight to the United States Supreme Court.
I'm with you. Very important. Why do you think these other people are so hesitant? They're just nervous.
I think there's a variety of reasons. I think that for too long, Republicans have not been bold enough in our use of the tools at our disposal to fight back against this sort of thing. We know lawfare has been going on against President Trump since 2016 when the deep state demanded that big tech censor the Hunter Biden laptop story, thereby denying the voting public of information necessary to make good decisions at the ballot box. The deep state then injected this Russian collusion hoax in an attempt to undermine President Trump's first years in office. So this is nothing new. It's evolved and gotten worse, and Republicans need to stand up and be bold and courageous and are striking back against this kind of illegal, unconstitutional behavior. No one would have tolerated it in 1860 if a rogue district attorney in the South had prosecuted Abraham Lincoln for speaking out on abolition issues and taken him off the campaign trail. And yet that's what's happening now.
So we're here with the Attorney General of Missouri, Andrew Bailey. Big story this evening. It's already on Reuters. Not that that means anything. But, in fact, 2 federal judges have, I guess simultaneously, but definitely close to each other in their rulings, have put a hold on a major part of this latest student loan unconstitutional debacle by Biden. Mr. Attorney General, he has a bad habit doing this. The first student loan went to the Supreme Court. They told him no, and he said, screw you. Then he comes up with this, and now a couple of federal judges said no, and you filed a petition to try and stop it. It looks like you were successful, at least at this stage. You have him with the CDC, using the CDC to impose vaccine requirements on major corporations. Supreme Court said no, you don't have that power. He actually uses OSHA, I think it was, to put rent control nationally. I made my agencies mixed up, same damn thing. And I go on and on and on. And then this guy's running around saying Trump is going to kill democracy, and he's defending it. What do you make of that?
President Biden is the greatest threat to democracy and to our democratic republic since the inception of our country. We've never seen, I know you've covered this extensively, and I think it's a very important point to make, that we haven't seen lawfare like this, where the government is weaponized against political opponents since the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. And if you think about that, this is even worse. At least the Alien and Sedition Act had enabling legislation from Congress. So the people's elected representatives spoke. Now, they spoke in an unconstitutional manner, but at least there was some consensus amongst leadership about the direction of the country. Here, this lawfare is much more nefarious because it's being conducted in shadows. It's clandestine. It's cloaked in this this kind of the majesty of the process. Now, we can see through that. We can look no further than the 34-count indictment that Alvin Bragg issued and realize that it's specious legal reasoning because they failed to identify the predicate offense. They can't identify it because it's either a federal offense or it's outside the statute of limitations. That deprives President Trump of his constitutional right to notice under the Due Process Clause. Then the gag orders handed down not only deprives President Trump of his First Amendment right, but our First Amendment right as Missourians to hear from a presidential candidate. So we know that these prosecutions are replete with constitutional error. The lack of jury unanimity violates the Sixth Amendment right of President Trump. So, but we have never seen anything like this in the history of this country. The closest we can look at is the Alien Sedition Act of 1798. And we know that in 1800, the Federalists were swept out of office because the people understood it was unconstitutional, it was illegal, and it violates our basic principles of fairness. I predict the same thing will happen here.
It's interesting, though, back then, you basically had the party press. The press was out in the open for one party or another, and even the titles of the papers kind of reflected that. Today, they all pretend to be impartial, objective media outlets when they're all in for the Democrat Party. So do you think that fact may help keep Biden in office, or do you think the American people are smarter than this?
I think the American people are smarter, but I also think that the American people are deprived of information. Look at the case Missouri v. Biden, where the Biden administration across a spectrum of bureaucratic agencies has silenced American voices on big tech social media platforms. Legacy media is going the way of the dinosaur, and certainly no one trusts the mainstream media. But if that's the only source of information, because they're not reporting conservative voices or any other viewpoint other than the Democrat Party line, and then conservatives are silenced on big tech social media at Biden's demand, then not only is our First Amendment right been violated, but again, we're not going to be able to have a free, fair, and open discourse in the lead up to the 2024 election. That lawsuit is all about building a wall of separation between tech and state to protect our First Amendment right to free speech. At trial, at the district court level, last May, the DOJ admitted that 100% of the speech that was censored on big tech was conservative voices, and it was all core political speech. The remedy in this country for disfavored speech has always been counter speech, not government censorship, but the federal government under Biden's watch has abandoned that approach, attacked our First Amendment rights, and that's why we're fighting so hard. I expect a decision out of the United States Supreme Court on that case any day now.
When do you think Attorney General Andrew Bailey, Missouri, you'll file that suit against New York?
We will be on file this week. Again, time is of the essence. We've got to build a coalition of like-minded state attorneys general. We've got to put our best legal argument, our best case forward. We've got to get it in front of the court because time is of the essence due to the nature of the sentencing. If the court in New York puts any onerous conditions upon President Trump, whether it be house arrest, imprisonment, shock time in a local jail, or even community service hours that are required each month, that time away from the campaign trail harms Missourians. And again, the traditional appellate remedies fail to fully redress the grievances that we're bringing. Now, I will submit to you that Article 3, Section 2 suits between states, those original actions, typically have to do with boundaries and water disputes, but there's nothing in the text of the Constitution that would preclude this kind of suit. And I think there are very interesting issues at stake here when we're talking about a local prosecutor and local judge essentially destroying the integrity of an electoral process and denying Missourians access to a political candidate.
I look at it this way. The Supreme Court can't act on its own. It needs petitioners. You're giving this court an opportunity to take the case and fix this. Because if this goes forward like this, no presidential candidate will be safe. You have a conflict of federal and state jurisdictions. The due process and equal protection clauses started in the 5th, applied to the states through the 14th. There are a lot. The First Amendment you mentioned, the gag rule. There are a lot of things here that this court needs to unpack. And if it doesn't unpack it now, they're going to get worse. And it's going to have to unpack it later. And the pressure will be even worse than it is today for them to do something about this. Don't you agree?
I completely agree. And I think that really speaks to the four factors that federal courts, to include the Supreme Court, look at when determining whether or not a stay is appropriate. Because essentially, that's what we're asking. We're asking the United States Supreme Court to stay any further action in the Bragg prosecution of President Trump. And if the first element is success on the merits, well, clearly, if there are constitutional errors in that trial, our likelihood of success on the merits is great. Secondly, irreparable harm. Well, the stake of our national election, that's what's at stake, and so the harm is absolutely irreparable. Whether a stay harms the other parties, it's not like Donald Trump is out creating new victims in New York. There were no victims to begin with. It's not like he's making additional entries into a business ledger.
But I think your strong point is, look, this is a national election. The federal campaign law that they don't even cite as exclusive plenary federal jurisdiction. All these violations in the courtroom of federal constitutional law applying to the states. And they're keeping, you can see the other side's using it as a weapon against Trump, which is a weapon against the people. In other words, you need an open and fair election where the playing field is as equal as you can make it. You can't have an elected Soros prosecutor who says, I'm going to get Trump, an appointed state judge who's conflicted up the wazoo, and every step of the way you can see it's a star chamber. And now you're supposed to also, you in Missouri, the Attorney General, you're supposed to sit on your hands while this thing works its way through this sluggish appellate process in New York. While the election's going on, it was purposely timed to affect it right now. And the people of Missouri just have to sit there and take it. As a matter of fact, people in the rest of the country have to sit here and take it. I think it's a strong argument to get it to the steps of the Supreme Court. And ultimately, they'll either take it or they won't. If they don't take it, they're going to pay a price for it down the road. And so are we as a people. If they do take it, they can help resolve it and nip this in the bud. I think it's a very, very good idea. I support it 100%. All right, Mr. Attorney General Andrew Bailey, good job, sir.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate you. Appreciate you covering these important issues.
And you too. Take care of yourself. God bless.